Hello everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the delivery webinar for the Australian wine sector's emission reduction roadmap today. My name is Sharon Harvey. I'm a Senior Research and Development Program Manager here at Wine Australia, and I manage the project that delivered the roadmap to us. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that the land we're broadcasting from today is the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we'd like to show this short video as an extension of that respect to wherever you are joining us from across the country today.
We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent, and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wardani salt bush peoples of Margaret River in our west, to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation, and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nioni peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
Okay, so just a bit of housekeeping also before we start. So the format will be about a 40-minute presentation by Sarah from Edge Impact to present the emissions reduction roadmap, and we'll follow that up with about 15 minutes of Q&A or whatever we have time for. If you have any questions as we go along, please submit them using the chat function you should be able to see on your screen, and we'll curate those as we go along and as best we can and address them during the Q&A session. Please note also that this webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to all registrants and available on the Wine Australia website following its conclusion. So just briefly by way of introduction, this project started in June last year when Wine Australia partnered with sustainability consultant Edge Impact to deliver an emissions reduction roadmap for the Australian grape and wine sector. It's our response to the increasing global urgency that we're all feeling around emissions reduction and the regulatory, market and social pressures being felt by producers and organisations to reduce their carbon footprint, not only of their operations, but also the products that they produce. And also it's a response to our recognition that this is a confusing, often fast-moving space, and it can be hard to know where to start or where you can take action to have real impact. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah Day from Edge to present the emissions reduction roadmap for the Australian grape and wine sector.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sharon, and welcome to everyone who's continuing to join the call. We've got 77 by this point in time, so it's great to have you all here. I am a principal consultant with Edge Impact. We're a full-service sustainability consultancy based in Australia, but with offices worldwide. And we've just absolutely loved working with the Australian wine industry through Wine Australia on this project. And many of you on the call today have been consulted as part of this project. And we really hope that that means that this is a document that is by wine producers for wine producers. And that's what's really going to lead to the ultimate success of this roadmap. In terms of what we're going to talk through today, as Sharon said, we've got around 40 minutes of content before we dive into some Q&A, and hopefully there's a few questions coming through in the chat through as we go, but we will hold those until the end of the session. At this stage, the idea is that we spend a little bit of time talking about climate change and decarbonisation. So basically what these terms mean, why we're focusing on these as part of the industry's sustainability focus, and what climate change and decarb mean for the wine industry. We're going to spend a little bit more time looking at our emissions, so scopes, numbers, the actuals, and how the wine industry stacks up with its current emissions footprint. we want to make sure that you understand our methodology, so how we went about calculating the emissions footprint of the industry and calculating the ultimate roadmap that we'll present today. And that's looking into how we reach that 42% emissions reduction target by 2030. Before introducing our roadmap, so what is our roadmap? What are we working towards? How are we going to get there? What are the initiatives that are available to the industry to support in reaching their emissions reduction target? Because this is really going to be a joint effort. It will rely on all members of the wine value chain to play their part, and there are various initiatives that are relevant to each part of the sector. So we'll talk through those in a little bit more detail. We will then go into a bit of detail around the journey ahead. So looking at the 5 key themes of emissions reduction and the target focus areas for us to think about as we go down this path, including a couple of examples from some of your peers who've already taken some initiative and started to measure their footprint and take action to reduce their footprint. And then touch on what some of the supporting documents will be. So what is it that you can go and read or print out and check off and start to look at, so that you can understand what this means to the industry as a whole, but also what it means to your organisation and your role within the Australian wine industry. So let's dive straight in. Climate change and decarbonisation. When we talk about climate change and decarbonisation, for the wine industry, it's been recognised that, I'll start that again. At Edge, we work with a whole range of industries to help them understand what sustainability means, but specifically what climate change is going to mean to their operations and what role they can play in decarbonising. As we play this role in, and my focus is in agriculture, so I spend a lot of time working with different commodities and farmers. Each of these industries is grappling with what climate change is going to mean. There's the wine industry and all agricultural industries are at the forefront of experiencing a shift in climate, and many of you have experienced drier conditions or wetter conditions or more extreme weather conditions. But we've really seen that the wine industry is taking particular notice because the vulnerability of the industry to a changing climate. The industry is so attuned to variations in climate, whether it comes down to shorter growing seasons or various other impacts. The industry really does acutely feel the impacts of a changing climate. And climate change has been recognised as the biggest threat to the grape and wine sector globally. It's important to note that in the course of this discussion, we're working towards a 1.5 degree warming scenario, and that's the number that's used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But relevant to note that in Australia, and that's an average globally, whereas in Australia, we're already experiencing around 1.4 degree warming in the last century. And if we let that sit for a moment, you start to understand why the changes we're experiencing are being felt so acutely. Because 1.4 degrees warming can have a really significant impact on production. So that's climate change and the physical risks that are associated with it and the impacts on operations. We also talk about the transitional risks though. So these are the risks that aren't necessarily going to be felt in your operations and your production, but through your market access and how you present and how customers start to deal with the industry. So the transitional risks of climate change can present in a number of ways, but the 3 big ways that we've identified for the wine industry, starting with exclusion from international markets. So we can see that there's various imposts being put on by various importing markets. So the EU in particular are looking at what the emissions intensity is of product and starting to refuse entry to the markets from products that have a high emissions intensity. So this has the potential to really impact the sector's growth and profitability long term if we're not able to access some of those key export markets. One of the other key risks is that backlash from domestic consumers and retailers. So in the same way that international markets are expecting low emissions intensity product, we're seeing our local retailers have strong opinions on their emissions profile and the role of wine as part of that, being able to demonstrate that it's a low environmental impact product. And that starts to negatively impact the viability of the sector and can result in a significant loss of revenue. In addition to those 2 risk factors, the Australian wine industry and Australian agriculture in general does rely on a really strong, clean, green image. And this has been built up by years of strong environmental credentials and being able to demonstrate that the industry is supportive of its beautiful natural environment here in Australia. The unfortunate flip side of that is if the industry can't demonstrate that it maintains that strong environmental treatment and working conditions in how it operates within the environment, there is a risk that the public and the media that surrounds all of the catastrophic climate events will start to attach itself to the wine industry and other agricultural products. So we need to be really careful that the industry the reputation that we've built up over time is maintained, and we maintain that credibility as a clean, green producer of Australian wine. So you can start to see that it is really a twofold approach here. So how can we reduce the impacts of a changing climate on our production and operations, but how do we maintain that market access and that viability in the face of changing social perceptions around emissions and the environmental costs of production? In sort of furthering that, when we start to look at some of the benefits of decarbonisation, we can really see that being sustainable is efficient ultimately, and that's why I choose to focus in agriculture and the work I do in sustainability. But if we start to identify some of those key sources of emissions within the business and target those inefficient processes, if we take the example of fertiliser, if instead of using fertiliser on a ad hoc basis and spraying liberally, and we start to use more precise methods of applying it, not only are we using yet less fertiliser, but we're reducing the amount of emissions associated with that. So we're reducing the costs associated with fertiliser use, but also the emissions. So that's a really easy and simple way to demonstrate how a more sustainable approach can reduce cost and emissions at the same time. And to that second point there around identifying those actions which you can take within your business to start to reduce some of the costs associated with running the business in terms of gas and electricity and fertiliser use and irrigation, this will help to reduce both those direct and indirect emissions and be a cost-saving measure as well. And some of the examples that we speak to a little bit later start to demonstrate the return on investment of transitioning operations towards solar or reducing that reliance on gas and electricity and fertiliser use. In addition, that access to wine markets, so both locally but internationally at the forefront, what is the unique proposition of the Australian wine industry and how can we position ourselves as a low emissions industry so that we can align with those increasing international expectations around sustainability. And that's not to say that the wine industry has already gone a really long way in demonstrating that. So it's just how do we continue to build that on that momentum of delivering on our sustainability credentials. So when we get to what this looks like for the industry, our vision here is by 2030 to have a really united approach to decarbonisation. If we get this right and if we all work together, and you'll see from the later parts of this presentation, there is a role for every part of the industry to play. But if we get this right, we are really well positioned to achieve a 42% reduction of emissions across the Australian grape and wine sector by 2030. And that's huge, but it's very much doable. And this number and this target is a result of a huge amount of consultation and a very science-backed approach to understanding exactly what is appropriate, what's plausible, what's possible for the industry. And we've landed on a number of 42% reduction. And we're really confident that is within reach. So in terms of our pathway to decarbonisation, the roadmap is about, how are we going to get there? 42%, great. What does that mean for the industry? What does that mean for each of us as components of the industry or as active participants in the industry? So essentially, this roadmap provides a baseline. So it helps us understand what are we tracking and how are we tracking against that target and where are the areas that we really need to be starting to focus. So the key emission sources, both in the vineyard, in the winery and through the supply chain, we can call these key emission sources, we call them hotspots, priority areas, but they're all about identifying where are our major issues. And once we've figured out what they are, we start to break that down and to develop this pathway that I'll present in a minute it's where's the bang for your buck? So we know that a particular emission source is a hotspot, but is it the most cost-effective approach? And is there the technology and the resources and the infrastructure available to make it viable? Or is that an initiative that we can focus on in 5 or 10 years' time once the technology develops? So we've tried to identify the low-hanging fruit here and look at the most cost-effective and effort-effective way to reach our target within the timelines we've prescribed. And finally, this is a document that will live and breathe and change over time. So as technology comes on board, as there are various advancements in the sector and we start to work towards those goals, we'll look at adapting the roadmap to make sure that we're keeping pace with the industry's changes and the operating environment that we're working within. So our emissions, and this is where it gets a little bit sciencey, but we're going to try and keep it high level so that it's relatable. But there is a whole lot more detail in the roadmap that I implore you to go and check out and have a read, and it really starts to break down what we're talking about when we say emissions and what each of the sources means. But first, to understand the impact of our emissions and where the greatest sources lie. So this roadmap is about identifying, we used a 2020-2021 baseline and then looked at identifying the key sources of emissions in the sector. And when we talk about the sector, we're talking from the growing through to transport, to the vineyard, to the winery, through processing, bottling and export or transport within Australia to our local markets. So the full value chain of emissions. And that's the best science model approach to calculating emissions. So when we went through this process, we've identified the greatest emissions are coming from those industrial processes in the supply chain. So around almost half of the emissions associated with wine production are coming from the products and services from your suppliers. So the extraction of raw materials, production and manufacturing of goods, and their transportation to market. So we start to understand that includes your bottling and your glass production. They are all part of your footprint. Transport is the next highest category with around 29% of all emissions. So this includes grapes from the vineyard to the winery and of the packaged wine to Australian and overseas markets. And that's a really, that's a significant portion, but it's important to note at this point that you're not alone in trying to tackle transport emissions. And just as the Australian wine industry is going down this path of developing an emissions reduction roadmap, almost all other Australian agricultural commodities are looking at their footprint and how they look to reduce their supply chain emissions. So transport companies will come under a similar amount of scrutiny from a broad range of industry players, both from the supplier side and the customer side. So it'll be a joint effort in tackling those emissions. We've got some specific initiatives that we'll come to through the course of today as well. When we get to the winery itself, we're looking at the emissions from electricity, so keeping the lights on, keeping the fridges cool, and fuels to run the winery as well as any leakage from refrigerant and the type of refrigerant comes into play there. As well as wastewater treatment and the commuting of employees to the winery. When we get to the vineyard emissions, that's only around 10% of total emissions for the industry, but these are including your electricity, fuels, irrigation, fertiliser use, and again, employee commuting. So it's worth noting that while these two areas of winery production and vineyard are lower than transport and the processes and supply chain, they are still crucial to help us reach our 2030 ambition. And they offer us a really direct way to reduce our emissions. They're what we call within our direct control. They're emissions that we can, as an industry, start to make really tangible action against and start to create change within our own direct operations before working with our supply chains and other partners to create changes throughout the entire wine value chain. And I just realised that I haven't actually stated the number that we're currently at. So just over 1,770,000 tonnes of emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent. When we're talking about carbon dioxide equivalent, carbon is sort of the standard unit that we use to talk about emissions as a sort of single unit, but that's incorporating the full ambit of greenhouse gases. What this equates to in terms of a sort of relative figure is around 609 laps of the world in a fully laden jet plane. So if we can start to visualise the emissions associated with that, we're looking at around the same number for the wine industry on an annual basis. Okay, so scope of emissions, and this is starting to talk through really the process of the analysis and the data. So when we're talking about the emissions and how we've broken them down, we start to talk about scopes. And scope 1 is looking at your direct vineyard and winery emissions. And if we can sort of take one step to the side from the previous slide where we're looking at how these are distributed between the wineries, the vineyards, and transport and supply and processes. If we're looking at more exclusively through the lens of scopes, we start to understand the direct and the indirect emissions associated with production. So the direct vineyard and winery emissions are what we call scope 1. These are making up around 6% of your profile, and these would be the use of machinery, fertiliser, refrigerant use, and wastewater management. And so these are areas where you have direct control, and it comes back again to that fertiliser example. The amount of fertiliser you use within your operations has a direct impact on your footprint, and it is directly correlatable, and you have direct control over that use of fertiliser. Scope 2, on the other hand, is your indirect vineyard and winery emissions. So this is purely around purchased electricity, and it starts to become clear when we break down the initiatives for the sector, the role of purchasing renewable electricity or converting operations to have on-site renewables, and the impact that can have on the overall emissions profile. When we start to look at scope 3, these are your indirect vineyard, winery, and supply chain emissions. And this is accounting for around 80% of your footprint. So a fairly significant amount. This is definitely the majority of your scope 3, the majority of your emissions. And this is comprising of transport and distribution, waste generated in the operation of vineyards and wineries, and goods and services. So all of the materials that go into producing wine that is not coming from the winery itself, from the vineyard itself. So packaging material, including cardboard and glass and cork and screw tops, imported water or water that's necessary for the production, chemicals, and we're also looking at the end of life of packaging. So once the wine has been consumed, what then happens with the cardboard and the glass and whatever other container it's in, they're all part of the footprint. This also entails the indirect emissions from fossil fuels associated with production and employee commuting. So when we start to look at it through these three lenses, it really demonstrates the need to broaden our awareness and think about this challenge as a whole of supply chain challenge, and look at opportunities to partner with those areas that seem to be outside of our direct control, but are still having an influence on our emissions profile. So what this really comes down to is how we can partner and work collaboratively to achieve the outcomes the industry needs, noting again that this is a problem that all sectors are having, is some of those emissions that are outside of our direct control, but still having a significant impact on our emissions profile. And if this all sounds super confusing, I totally appreciate that. Part of the materials associated with the rollout of this roadmap is a whole series of tools and calculators that you can access and download and subscribe to that can help you understand what the emissions are associated with your direct operations. So we'll go through the various sort of collateral in a minute, but there is plenty of information out there that can really help you to understand what you're working with directly, so that you can start to make informed decisions about where your greatest impacts are and where you need to be focusing your attention. So in terms of the methodology that we adopted to calculate this roadmap, we had significant engagement with the industry. So we did really want to make sure that this was informed by industry and it was something the industry could take and use in a variety of ways. So something that the industry can go to international customers with and have a really informed conversation about what emissions mean to the Australian wine industry and what the industry is doing about it. But also that they can take home and print out and have a checklist to understand, what's in it for me and what can I do about my footprint and how can I continue to support the industry towards its emissions reduction goals. So we really did involve the entire production and supply chain, as you can see from this extensive list of engagement, to ensure that this is a roadmap for the sector by the sector. The intention was really to give the sector what it wants, but also what it needs. So we did use a lot of the reference group and those interviews that are detailed there to test some of our assumptions. So when I spoke earlier about identifying those low-hanging fruit, where do we target and where do we avoid to make sure that the recommendations we're putting forward are in line with what the industry is working towards and what's feasible for the industry to employ. The first sort of look at the full roadmap for the industry was back in June at the ASVO's CO23 Climate Mitigation Conference, and we had over 300 registrants at that conference and got some good feedback on where we were hitting the mark and where we needed to provide a little bit more detail to make sure that it was easily understandable by the industry. Okay, so our methodology. Essentially, the data that we relied on first and foremost was sourced from the 2021 financial year reporting period, and we reached a real breadth of resources to ensure that we were sort of collating a really holistic and accurate representation of the emissions profile for the Australian wine sector. So we started with the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia platform and the information they had on the sector, and then we sort of correlated this or cross-checked this against some wine production company sector data. So actual data from wineries that can start to sort of break down the numbers and make sure that what we're seeing from Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is aligned to what's happening in a couple of other operations. We then started to compare this to some Wine Australia production and export numbers to make sure that when we're talking about the qualities going through export and production are lining up with the amounts that are coming out of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia and the wine production company, and we're starting to get those consistent numbers and that there's strong correlation. We then looked to some peer-reviewed research and publications to make sure that the what we call the emissions factors, so the numbers that we're associating with each emission and its source and how it's presenting in terms of the overall footprint, is in line with what is the sort of most scientific, rigorous process by using a number of peer-reviewed sources. We also looked at a life cycle assessment of the Australian wine industry, and what this essentially is breaking down each of the categories and impacts and contributing factors to an emissions to an industry's footprint and correlating against that. And we, throughout this whole process, used emissions factors that we sourced from a program called ExaioBase, which looks at an Australian life cycle inventory, as well as climate active data, which supports the use of emissions factors and all the data that was going into the big numbers. So essentially, long story short, we tried to use as many different sources of data to make sure that what we're presenting is the most accurate representation of the industry's footprint. And how this presents. So all of this data went into modelling the footprint of over 1.77 million tonnes of emissions carbon dioxide equivalent. And we modelled this into what's called a marginal abatement cost curve, so a cost-benefit analysis, essentially. And while this graph itself doesn't show those cost reductions, the idea is that it visualises our potential for decarbonisation. So each of the initiatives presented here have been modelled in terms of their feasibility, the cost of implementing, and the impact they will have on the overall emissions profile. As we selected these, we had a sort of long list, and then we worked with the expert reference panel to make sure that what we were nominating as the relevant initiatives of the industry were actually going to be adopted by the industry. So we didn't want to put anything on here that was totally unviable and would never be taken up. We want to make sure that what we're presenting as opportunities for the industry to decarb are going to be realistic and usable by the industry. So if we look at each of these initiatives in turn, which we'll do in the coming slides, we start to understand that in order to achieve that 42% reduction by 2030, we need to be prioritising some of these initiatives. All of these initiatives need to be actioned, and there's no necessary order in terms of which one goes first. But you can start to see that each initiative requires a different part of the industry to take action. And there's a broad range of initiatives across the industry, which means we're really relying on that sector-wide collaboration and action in order to achieve this real gradual but systemic transition to a lower carbon economy. And so how does this break down in terms of what each of the initiatives mean and where the role is for the industry to take action, each part of the industry to take action? So if we start with Scope 1 emissions, so those direct vineyard and winery emissions, if we're looking specifically at the role of vineyards and what growers can do, the electrification of diesel-powered irrigation systems is going to be really important in reducing the emissions associated with wine production. So this is going to be reducing around 946 tonnes of emissions per year. And it's just about converting water pumps from fossil fuels, so from diesel-based to electric. The second initiative along is looking at Scope 2. So if we think back to the way we break down the scopes, what are our electricity uses within the vineyard and the winery, and how can we reduce the emissions associated? And this was around the 12% of the emissions is coming from the Scope 2. So the purchase of renewable electricity is quite a significant one and will contribute around 86,000 tonnes each year of emission savings. So this is looking at 100% of all electricity into vineyards and wineries coming from renewable sources. The third initiative is looking at grid decarbonisation, and this is acknowledging that across Australia there is significant action, particularly coming from South Australia, looking at how we can decarb the Australian grid. And this will continue to play a strong and significant role in decarbing the sector as a whole, but will need to be worked in as the sector itself elects to purchase electricity from renewable sources. That will be complemented by the grid decarbonising over time to 2030 and beyond. Electrodialysis units for cold stabilisation will look to contribute around 3,500 tonnes to the reduced footprint on an annual basis. And this is around reducing the winery's usage of electricity and perhaps an alternative to cold stabilisation across the larger wine production sites. Flotation for juice clarification is going to have an impact of around 687 tonnes of emissions savings. And this will be about identifying those alternatives to cold settling. The final initiative in terms of the Scope 2 is looking at on-site solar. So acknowledging that there's choosing to purchase renewable electricity, the grid itself is decarbing, but also there's an option there for growers and vineyards wineries to look at generating solar on site. And these three areas will have to act in concert in order to achieve the emissions reduction target that we've set. But what are the opportunities on site to generate solar and look at directly reducing emissions through that measure? That will contribute around 7,700 tonnes to the emission savings. And I appreciate there's a lot of information here, but it is all in the roadmap in a lot more detail. So there's definitely more reading to be done and more detail that sits behind each of these initiatives. When we look to Scope 3, so these are the indirect emissions associated. And if you recall, this is around 80% of the footprint for the industry. So a really significant proportion is not necessarily within our direct control, but is an area that we can have direct influence over through the relationships and partnerships that we develop. The first one there is around an increased use of lightweight bottles. If we reduce the weight of glass bottles when it comes to the production of the bottle itself, but also the transport, we start to see significant savings of around 123,000 tonnes of emissions. So that's a really significant portion of the footprint that is coming from the use of the heavier bottles currently. The second issue there around reduced emissions shipping. This is accounting for around 21,000 tonnes, so a pretty big part of the pie as well. And we are already seeing some of the major shipping companies start to understand how they can reduce their footprint, but this comes down to both the use of the fuel for the shipping and the way that we're shipping bottles as well. Shipping products, so whether that's in bottles or in mass production, in mass units. When we look at the reduction associated with emissions of road transport, there are actions underway within the supply chain to start to reduce the emissions associated. So it's perhaps just a matter of working directly and in keeping those parts of the supply chain aware of the Wine Australia's emissions reduction role or target, and making sure that there is that two-way communication around the industry's expectations, which will just continue to spur the road transport sector to look at how they're reducing their emissions. Road transport will account for 115,000 tonnes of emission savings per year, so that's significant as well. When we're looking at lower energy glass production, so separate to the use of lightweight bottles, which is around the intensity of the bottle itself and the weight of it, when we're looking at how the glass is made, if the producer of glass is using lower emissions energy, the product itself has a lower associated emission footprint. So starting to influence glass producers to use a lower emissions electricity for producing the glass. Supply chain decarbonisation in general is going to account for around 14,000 tonnes, and this is all of the sort of wraparound services which support the industry. How can we make sure that they are continuing to decarbonise within their services and goods production? So that's again working with partnerships and making really clear what the intentions are of the wine industry and communicating those to achieve those reduced outcomes or reduced emissions outcomes more broadly. So our journey ahead, where are we going and how are we going to get there? Worth just noting that we have focused on 5 key themes today and throughout the roadmap. And the idea is that achieving the full potential of the reduction opportunity to 2030 and in turn safeguarding the future for Australian wine, both through reducing those physical risks but also those transitional risks, will require a focus on these 5 key themes that have been developed through that extensive consultation with the industry. Data is going to be a really, really big one. So making sure that we're consistent about the data that we're gathering and that we are working with the right data to actually inform our business decisions. So as a business, how are you collecting data, how are you storing it, and then how are you using it to inform your decision-making will be a really important part of getting this right and reaching those targets. Secondly reducing and eventually eliminating the use of fossil fuel vehicles, both within the vineyards and within winery operations and ultimately in the supply chain, will have a significant impact on the ultimate footprint of the industry. The third piece there is around operating efficient and grape and wine production sites, and this is focusing primarily on renewable electricity and the role of renewable electricity in our operations. Fourthly is optimising the transport. So through our distribution networks and both within Australia and through export networks, how can we make sure that those networks are operating in line with our expectations when it comes to reducing emissions and aligning with all the hard work the industry itself is doing. And finally, collaboration. So with our wine supply chain, with our partners, all the goods and services that we're procuring to develop the Australian wine, how can we make sure that there is a collaborative approach to emissions reduction? Each of these areas need to be underpinned by an approach which we call the mitigation hierarchy. And the idea is to first avoid emissions where possible, and then look at reducing emissions where we can't avoid them, replacing emissions or emission sources, and then as a last measure, look at offset. And I know that offset is a hot topic in the industry at the moment, and it's not covered within the scope of this report. But how we talk about carbon offsets and biodiversity offsets is a topic for a whole nother roadmap, but not in today's session. So we thought we'd just give a few examples of where wineries or where some of your peers have started to create change and what that looks like, and starting to distinguish where there are areas within our control versus areas that are perhaps within our influence, so that we can start to understand the next best steps. In terms of vineyards and wineries, the focus here is really on reducing emissions generated from those direct sources. So, and we've seen that there are perhaps more limited opportunities within the vineyards to reduce those, but there are still some really tangible actions that can be taken. Winemakers and growers have direct control over emissions from diesel-powered vehicles and machinery and the use, sourcing and generation of electricity, in addition to fertiliser use. And ultimately, if we can start to reduce those reliances, we can start to find some of those cost savings and efficiencies and emission savings ultimately. We've provided an example here of Tabik Winery. So back in 2021, they installed a solar array with an annual cost saving of around $17,000 in 2022, which rose to $23,000 in 2023 as the prices of electricity have increased. And while this installation cost around $145,000, with a series of sort of state government rebates and other, the cost of electricity rising, we're looking at a return on investment within 5 years, and looking at reduced cost of electricity or sort of negligible cost of electricity for around 15 years post payback, and that is a significant saving for the winery, but also a significant emission saving, which I think really justifies that investment and provides a great example of what's possible. There was an additional investment where they converted the wine refrigerant systems to ammonia from glycol refrigeration systems, and had an annual saving, or experiencing an annual saving of around $58,000 and an ROI of 6 years. So that's also a pretty great example of leadership in the industry in terms of direct emissions within our direct control. When we're looking at the supply chain and areas we can influence, this is where we can start to achieve some significant and really measurable reductions, but we need to be able to work within our influence and inform decision making and support the supply chains to understand our position and what's important to the wine industry. So we're really looking at that collaboration piece, where we can purchase energy efficient infrastructure and assets, and support the transition to those lower emission sources of refrigeration and water pumps and other areas. And as we've mentioned, glass production and transport are critical to us achieving our targets. So where are the opportunities to influence glass producers? And if they're any on the call today, welcome. But this will play a really important role in the industry reaching our target of 42% by 2030. So we've put an example there of Aurora Glass, who are really leading the way in terms of sustainable beveraging packaging, including 100% wind power in South Australia. The recycled content of the glass going from 40% to 70% is a really significant step in reducing the emissions intensity associated with glass bottles. And they're committed to a hydrogen cluster project to really drive renewable energy within wine glass bottle production. Another area that's worth noting is that there are significant emerging technologies that are coming online, and there's an opportunity to maintain those relationships with our supply chain partners and other industries as we sort of shift and adapt to the technology landscape that will continue to evolve, where we can start to integrate technological improvements and drive those greater emission reductions through focusing on performance and reducing our reliance on the high emitting sources within our industry, and support the transition for those glass and manufacturing and transport industries as well. we're very cognizant that the current cost of some of these technologies is unviable, and for that reason, things like electric tractors haven't been factored in directly into the roadmap, and the cost can be prohibitive for some of those smaller business operators, but that will continue to come down as the market is ready for them, and they become more of a standard option, and that will feed into the redesign of the roadmap as we adapt. And it is expected that the cost of investing in that kind of capital will continue to reduce. We've got an example here from Henschke, who have committed to drawing solar from on-site production. So where possible, they've got 2 systems, which is drawing which is providing the majority of their emissions, and they're filling a battery with the excess solar. And this has been part funded by a state government through the Energy Productivity Program. So a really great initiative here, which has looked to establish a bit of a microgrid. So how can we sort of use our available land and start to create alternative revenue or reduce that reliance on grid electricity while having some emission savings as well. In addition, something that has been touched on through the course of the roadmap development and is a very hot topic more broadly in agriculture is the ability of agriculture to store carbon. So through vegetation, trees, plantings, and through soil. We know that planting vegetation around vineyards is a strong opportunity for carbon sequestration, but it also provides multiple other benefits. When we look at increased biodiversity, air and water filtration, and erosion control, there's been some recent reports around the role of building vegetation and biodiversity into agricultural production systems and how important that can be for increasing resilience and really building that farmer sort of production through the nature services that come from establishing a more biodiverse and richer ecosystem. Carbon farming will increasingly become more feasible as sort of the metrics improve and we get better at understanding the total sequestration opportunities from vines. But it's a work in progress, and at this stage it wasn't something we wanted to include directly in terms of accounting into the roadmap for fear of confusing the messaging, and we wanted to make sure that what we're focusing on right now is how we can reduce emissions before focusing on where we're looking at sequestering or offsetting. I've just noticed the time, Sharon. I think I've got one more slide, so hopefully we can I'll hurry along. We do just have an example here from Duxton Vineyards, who have started to apply some regenerative practices to look at how they can improve their soil health through the use of cover crops and minimum till farming, and how they're looking at increasing biodiversity and the benefits to operations directly from increasing access for bees and other native flora and fauna, which has been really well received by both the operators and the investors. In terms of the supporting documents, we do have 3 key documents that we've developed to support the rollout of the roadmap. The roadmap itself, so the emissions reduction guide, which is the sort of flagship document, but we've also produced a guidance document which supports the calculations and provides all of the sort of behind the scenes around how this is calculated, what this means for each part of the supply chain, and really starts to break down some of the initiatives and makes them really tangible. In addition, we've developed a carbon accounting tools guide, which basically gives you a really great resource for going and understanding how you can take action and where you should be looking for further resources to help you account for the emissions within your direct operations. And Sharon, I think I might hand to you for this last slide.
Sure thing. Thanks, Sarah. So just in closing, I guess we just wanted to make clear that this isn't a set and forget sort of document. We're not going to deliver this and stand back and say, here you go. We'll continue to support the sector through investment in regional initiatives and ongoing comms and sharing of success. We've got a whole raft of measures planned that are detailed in the roadmap itself, and there's a few here. I guess one of the key things is that we'll be reviewing our emissions footprint leading up to 2030 to see how we're tracking. So initially we'll do a review in 2025, which is not too far away, but it's 5 years from our baseline. So we'll see how we're going. And then again in 2028 to see how we're tracking. And even if we don't necessarily revisit the whole baseline, we'll be looking at some of those key initiatives that Sarah's described to see how we're going, see if anything else has come into train. And then obviously 2030 to see if we got there or if we didn't. And either case it's fine, but we'll know why, because we've got all the data and scientific backup to tell us why. And then we'll sort of look ahead to towards 2050 and potentially net zero and what's coming down the line to help us achieve our next lot of targets. So plenty there, more to come. And so that, I guess, brings us to the Q&A, Sarah. So we've got a bit of time for Q&A. So we've had a couple come in. So one is the do nothing scenario on the waterfall chart seems to be responsible for a fair proportion of the emissions reduction. So can you please explain what the do nothing scenario actually means?
Sure, and thanks, Wendy, for the question. There was, based on the modelling, there was agreement that there will be somewhat of a reduction in the volumes of Australian wine produced over the next 7 years to 2030. So there's some emission savings associated with purely a reduced volume of production, and so that's what the do nothing comes from.
It's the unfortunate reality, I'm afraid. But, if it changes, then we'll remodel. And how does the carbon footprint of Australian wine compare with our overseas counterparts? Sarah, have you got a feel for that?
I do. It's hard to say because the way that it's calculated can differ somewhat. Our approach is considered best practice in terms of accounting for all of the elements along the way, and it gives you that really holistic picture of what is necessary and what levers are available to create change. But the boundaries that are used to calculate this aren't always the same. Different industries and different countries and organisations will use different boundaries that suit their numbers sometimes, which is unfortunate. But the footprint and the whole of life cycle approach that we've taken gives us a much clearer idea of, the role of winemaking, packaging, distribution, all the other factors that contribute, so that we're really clear about where emissions are coming from, and we're going in with an eyes wide open approach. So for that reason, it is quite hard to distinguish, but there are a lot of studies out there which give you a general idea and compare wine to other sort of luxury goods or other snacks, so you can start to understand what the footprint looks like in comparison. Great,
thank you. And we've had a couple more come through. What underlying data in the modelling would you like to improve the most, if any, moving forward?
Sharon, I think the more that winemakers collect this data, the better the integrity of the data will be. The trick with this is, the first time you do your footprint, there is a huge amount of data that you need to collect. It can be significant, and if you're not keeping track of your fertilizer use and your fuel use and your other sort of inputs, it can be quite a daunting task. But year on year, we see it getting a lot easier for clients. So I think if as an industry we start to do it in a consistent way, and we're all working towards the same goal with the same numbers and the same expectations in terms of data, then we'll be in a much better position as the years go by to get clearer on how we're tracking. But in terms of the industry as a whole, I think we've got a really good starting point, and we're really comfortable with the data that we've got. Unless there's anything you want to add to that, Sharon, around areas that you think there could be increased visibility.
Yeah, no, I don't think so, Sarah. I think that, as you say, those indirect emissions, the packaging and distribution and so on, the data around that will sort of firm up for us when they get better at their own direct emissions and measuring that data. So it all sort of feeds down the chain, and we kind of all improve together, I guess. And I guess the other thing to note is we knew that it probably wouldn't be perfect and there'd be holes in the data, but you just have to make a start, I think, even though, understanding that it's not going to be perfect.
Definitely. And I think, comparing to some other industries, Wine Australia and the Australian wine industry has been incredibly progressive in taking this step and really being prepared to dive pretty deep into what the industry footprint currently looks like and start to set targets against that. It is incredibly progressive in comparison to some of the other agricultural industries. So it should definitely be applauded. And one of our favourite things in sustainability is to say that we seek progress over perfection. It's not a 100% perfect representation, but it's the best possible start with the data we've got, and sets us up really well to start to achieve those goals.
Awesome. And what is your view of the effect customers' preference or knowledge of brands and their efforts to reduce emissions has on their behaviour? So that's a consumer behaviour kind of question.
We're all consumers in one way or another, but we can all be incredibly fickle when it comes to these things. And ultimately, I think, trends have a really important role to play here. But the expectation for a low emissions product will just continue to become common. We do see that there are certain commodities which fly under the radar a little bit, and they're perhaps the commodities which are considered everyday staples, whereas the luxury goods like Wagyu and wine and other sort of luxury products, not necessarily luxury to everyone, don't mind a glass of wine on a regular basis, but for those luxury products, they can attract a high level of scrutiny. So if people are conscious about their emissions footprint, they will expect that those products which are considered luxury don't contribute negatively to their sort of lifestyle footprint.
Yeah, there's that social license sort of side of things.
Yeah, and I think getting ahead of it early is the most important part, so that it doesn't ever get put onto the blacklist and can maintain its current image.
Yeah, totally. Do organisations have to set a base year of 2020 to 21 if they have a commitment to some carbon mark programs, or are they fine to use their current year or near historic year which has good data?
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to respond to that one. I'm not fully across how the carbon mark program works.
Yeah, no, I'm not either, sorry. So I can't really help there. But I imagine, you can only, your baseline year is probably best set on one that you have good data for. So if that's a recent year or your current year, then, that's your place to start. You just need an arbitrary starting point, surely. But again, I'm not up with what the carbon mark regulations are.
Yeah, the idea is that we have a representative year. So that can be an average of 3 years or a year which sort of feels and looks the same as what most other years have, and that's the baseline. In agriculture specifically, we're so reliant on climatic, responsive to climatic events that the amount of rainfall or the amount of dry days can have a significant impact on the emissions profile. So it's about finding a year that feels about right compared to the others without being too far in the past. But each of the tools that are in the guidance in the tools document will detail how to best find a baseline year.
Awesome. Okay, I think we could do more, but I think we're going to have to stop because of time. So thank you so much, Sarah, for that fantastic presentation. I'll just quickly flick to the next slide, which has got our where you can interact with us and stay in touch. So just check that out yourselves. Thanks so much, Sarah, for your fantastic presentation. It was really great to unpack the roadmap in this forum. Thanks to Hannah and Harrison from Wine Australia here, who've kept things running smoothly in the background and kept us on the straight and narrow. And I'd also like to acknowledge Julian Marchant, formerly of Edge, who got this project going and had a lot to do with bringing it home. So you should receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and to the dedicated landing page for the roadmap on the Wine Australia website, and the address is on the screen there. We'll be regularly updating this page with the latest information and research and tools and advice and funding opportunities and ways for you to be involved. So please join the network and keep in touch. Also on that page is a contact email address, or you're very welcome to reach out to me directly if you have any further questions, or if we didn't get to yours today, and we had a late run of questions, so apologies that we didn't get to them all. And I really hope you've heard some things today to get you excited, and that you feel a part of whole industry action on emissions. You know, the roadmap is sort of our call to action, if you like, and we hope it's going to be a really helpful tool in our transition to a low carbon future. It demonstrates our sector's shared commitment to decarbonisation, and it invites our partners in the supply chain and beyond to be part of collective action, as Sarah said. It demonstrates to our customers, consumers and markets that we are serious about reducing our emissions and that we intend to proactively address them and to contribute to wider agricultural, state, federal government and international targets. So please join us. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and bye for now.